Okay, so let's go back to our data set. This is the output of some R code that goes through and calculates a whole bunch of things to help us to get our test statistic and ultimately helps us to make some decisions. I'm never going to ask you to calculate these things by hand. We're always going to be able to have R do it for you, but I think it's worthwhile to talk about each of these pieces and where they're coming from and why we're even calculating them to help you understand better where this table is coming from and why it's useful. So let me start with, we're kind of building this table from left to right. This row here that has to do with the depth, that's our groups column or groups row. So in this case, there was 3 groups, okay? So I'll just write K is equal to 3, right? Okay, there was 3 groups, surface, mid-depth, and was it bottom, I think? Okay, and then this second row, that has to do with the residuals. So sometimes I'll call this the error. Okay, that row has to do with all things related to the error. And then this last row, which R doesn't actually calculate out for you, this is your total row. I'll steal those. Okay, so that has to do with your overall. Okay. From there, the first thing we might want to do is work out the degrees of freedom. So this thing here is my degrees of freedom for the groups. So I'll just say degrees of freedom groups. Sometimes I'll denote that DFG. And it's always going to be K minus 1. So the number of groups minus 1. So in this case, because there was 3 groups, we do 3 minus 1 and it gives me 2. That's where that number is coming from. Okay. This number here, that's the degrees of freedom error. Okay. So again, I might write that DFE. Okay. That's always going to be N, which is the total sample size, minus K. Okay, so maybe I'll just write this. This is total sample size minus the number of groups. So in this case, there was 30 total samples. Remember, we sampled 10 from each group, each of the different depths. So there was 30 total, and then we minus 3 to give me that 27. They don't write this in here, but we also do have a degrees of freedom total. And you can sort of think about just like adding downwards. So 2 plus 27 gives me 29. And that piece there, let's go over here, that you can think of as your degrees of freedom total. Okay. And there's a couple of different ways to get there. So one option is that you can do N minus 1, so 30 minus 1 gives you 29, or your degrees of freedom total is always equal to your degrees of freedom for your groups plus the degrees of freedom for your error. Okay, so we can always just sort of add downwards. Okay, and we're going to use these degrees of freedom when we go through and do some other calculations.